Hello, happy fall day. Today I thought I would start painting some fall leaves. Stepped outside, just a few are starting to fall from the trees. Both of these are a nice pretty red. I kind of wish they had more variety of colors in them, so I won't be following them exactly, but kind of fun to get some real ones to look at while I'm painting. These are the main paint colors I'm going to use. We'll see if I have to break out any others, but I've got some burnt sienna, raw sienna, burnt umber, and some alizarin crimson. So definitely some more of those neutral colors, but of course I want a little bit of bright red, or at least some red I can mix in with them. So I'm gonna go ahead and put these 4 on my paint palette today to work with. Okay, I've got my paints out. Oftentimes I work from dry paint when I'm painting, but since I wanted to focus on using these colors, I've put some fresh paint out, and that's just fine. I'm gonna go ahead and draw out just a basic leaf shape so that I can know where to keep my water today. So I'd suggest doing some sort of sketch. It does not have to look exactly like a leaf. As you can see, every leaf is a little bit different. I'm gonna draw this sketch very lightly with my pencil so that I don't see those pencil lines once I start painting. So done a basic leaf shape. I tried to draw lightly, but I think I'll go back and even erase it a little bit more so it's harder to see. That might make it harder for you to see my lines as well, so just kind of take a look where they are now, and you'll of course see them once I start adding more paint to the lines. But I'd suggest you do this if you don't want to see those pencil lines at the end. You might also know that I tend to use pens, and so at the end I'll probably be doing some pen drawing on top because I like the look of combining pen with watercolor, so I'll probably be using my Micron. But since I don't know where my colors are going to go exactly, I'm going to save that for the last step today. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is create a wash across my leaf with some of my lighter colors. So for me, that's going to be my raw sienna. I'm going to use mostly a round brush today, so I can use both kind of the wide side of it and also the tip. So I've loaded my brush with water, and I'm going to go ahead and try to fill my whole leaf with wet water. I'm trying to be consistent about where, how much water. So I don't want there to be puddles on one part of the leaf and only a very small amount of water on the other. So I'm starting with like a whole puddle of water, and then I'm just spreading that around, paying attention to where my pencil lines are, because when I add my wet paint, that wet paint will only go where the wet area is. So if I put water there, the paint color will go there. So this is kind of like my zone that I'm creating by filling in the drawing with the water. I do have to do this part kind of quickly to make sure that it doesn't dry before I actually add my paint. So I'm consistently looking around for areas that are already fading or drying. I want the whole thing to be shiny to make sure that it all will grab the paint equally. Okay, my whole leaf is shiny except for the stem. I'm gonna leave that for later. So I'm gonna go ahead and get a little bit of my raw sienna. It's very yellowy color, and I'm watering it down to make sure it'll be smooth. And I'm gonna go ahead and kind of just spread that around, mainly in the central areas, because I already know that my edges will be dark, so I don't really care if the raw sienna gets close to the edge. It should naturally spread towards the edge because I've made everything wet, but I don't have to try to follow my lines exactly since I did put water there. Now that I have this in the center, I'm gonna move to a little bit of my alizarin crimson, knowing that that's my very brightest color, and I'm gonna bring that to the edges of my leaf and have it kind of run towards my raw sienna. By putting the colors next to each other, I'm giving them the opportunity to kind of mix on their own without me completely making a brand new color. So I'm using the watery area to let that paint run together. Knowing that I'll be covering some of this red up because it's a super bright color. So I don't want to leave it necessarily as bright as it is. Otherwise it won't look natural. As you might have noticed in the fall, all the colors tend to become less saturated. They start to mute, and become more brown or faded, which is why I have a lot of browns in my paint palette today. So even though I'm using a bright red now, I won't the whole time. Now, what you might notice is happening is a super cool, just happy accident where this red is starting to find pathways into the yellow. So I want to keep working while my leaf is wet. I'm going to go to some of my darker brown, which is that burnt umber. I'm going to start adding that with my red at the edge, letting it mix with the red and run towards the yellow to make sure I'm getting some of that more neutralized color value I was talking about. By letting the colors mix on the paper instead of pre-mixing them, I'm gonna end up with more varieties. If I were to take my brown and red and mix them and make a brand new color on my paint palette, I'd have a very pretty neutralized red, but I wouldn't see as many variety of colors on my actual paper. Because look how there are some areas that are bright red, some areas that are more brown. That's because I'm letting those colors mix on the paper instead of on my paint palette. I'm kind of going back and forth with some of my red now, to make sure that none of those brown areas are too brown. Now, if I look at my actual leaf, I've got these veins that go down the middle. And also, there's not quite this much yellow. So I'm gonna start with my more orangey color. That one's that raw sienna, and it's kind of a red-orange. And I'm gonna start bringing that into the center here while everything is still wet, creating those different vein areas to figure out where I'm gonna want my darker colors. So I created a center line going towards the biggest part of the leaf. And now I'm creating those other veins with kind of this orange color. This is kind of my framework now for where my other colors will go. So I can go back to my red and maybe add some of that in with the veins, making sure that it's not just orange. Otherwise my orange kind of feels out of place because that's not anywhere else in my painting yet. So I want to mix it with the colors that I'm already using, like my alizarin crimson. So now that orange is becoming even more of a red orange. And it's all still mixing because my paper is still fairly damp. It's drying, which is why I'm working fairly quickly, but it's not completely dry. I'm gonna go to my burnt umber and add some of that to the center as well to make sure I still get that more muted brown tone. Trying to leave some areas with the yellow because that's my lightest value, but I also want most of my leaf to be a red color. Okay, when I look at my art, I've got quite a bit of contrast in the center, but I think I'm gonna take my brown and really make some nice dark edges to my leaf. This time I'm gonna do that thing where I mix a little bit of brown and red together because here is where I really want that nice dark edge. So I'm kind of pooling my paint right along the edge of the painting to make sure I have this nice hard contrast at the edge. And this is kind of where it's fun to kind of go past your drawing a little bit and create those nice pokey edges that might be there in reality. So look how I've kind of bumped out the edge of that space to make it look more real, like random, like a true leaf has those pokey bits. It might be missing a spot, it might have gotten ripped or torn. So by going over the edges a little bit while they're still wet and malleable, I can create that more realistic edge effect. I'm really having a good amount of saturation in my paint right now, so it's more of a milky consistency to make sure that this dark color is really dark. If I have too much water on my paintbrush, then it's not going to create this higher contrast I'm talking about. So I'm making sure that I'm using quite a bit of the actual paint and less water, just enough water that it's, you know, watercolor paint, but keeping that color really saturated. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and add a bunch more water to my brush and kind of drop in some more of my middle tones. I'm mixing some reds and browns and looking for areas that are kind of feeling disconnected or overly bright. And I'm just kind of dripping some of this in to tone down some of those dark areas. I'm almost done with my wet on wet layer, which is most of the hard work in this painting, and then we'll do a little bit of dry on wet once I finish these random pieces. So look how I'm really working in small areas, and I'm keeping, I've really used the same size brush the whole time, because by turning it sideways, I can create a large area of painting, and by using its tip, I can make my tiny details. So I'm looking for a balance in lights and darks and contrast. I think I'm gonna go ahead and dry this. You can either let it dry just by waiting, or you can use a heat gun or a hair dryer, and then once it's dry, we'll do our next step. Okay, I've gone ahead and dried this. I've actually used a heat gun and my paper is kind of warm, so watch out for that. The last step I really want to do is just create those nice veins that kind of go down in each direction. When I look at real leaves, some of those veins, sometimes they're kind of a brighter, lighter color. Sometimes they're kind of this dark brown. It depends on kind of either how the light hits it or how the leaf changed as it fell from the tree. So what I think I'll actually start with is one of my white gel pens, because I think having some of those highlights can be fun, and then I could go back on top and change some of them into that darker tone. So I'm gonna go ahead and pay attention to, looks like there's like a long line down the center and then a few kind of going towards those different peaks. So I'm gonna use my white pen, create, doesn't have to be super bold or obvious, keeping a reference, looking at my leaf here for reference. Looks like just kind of going towards those peaks. And if there's broken parts of your leaf, then obviously those peaks might be missing, but you can kind of imagine where they would be if the leaf was in good shape. Okay, so I've got a few of those little highlights, kind of subtle, which was the idea. I'm gonna switch to one of my really small, tiny little brushes, and I'm gonna go ahead and add some more colors on top. Now, I really said I was only gonna use these colors, but I kind of want just a tiny bit of green to make that kind of contrast in the inside. So I'm gonna cheat, even though you really can't cheat. I'm just gonna get some more of my regular paints out and use any kind of green. So I'm gonna grab just a little bit of green, bring it over here, maybe add some brown to it so it's not super obvious. And I'm just gonna go kind of next to some of these little veins to create almost a shadow, so it could look like this is the side of that vein. It could overlap the white even a little bit to make it look like it's not all the highlight. And I tried to be, when I drew my highlights, to not be exact so that it didn't look like an actual harsh white line, but just looked kind of random, like I let my pen kind of skip over the paper so that it wasn't consistent all the way. And now I can kind of fill in some of those gaps with the green on my brush. Now green and red are complementary colors, and so if the green is a little transparent and overlaps the red, it will look brown as the two colors visually mix together, which is great because brown is a great fall color. It makes everything feel more neutral. So if you feel like your green is too bright or if it's too opaque and you can't see through it, then you can either water it down so it's more transparent, or you could actually mix it with a little bit of red to make it less vibrant. So whenever you want to dull a color, you mix the complementary color with it just a tiny bit, and that helps to dull and make it less saturated. So green is a fun color to kind of add to our red leaf because it's the complement. So one thing it does is it makes the red stand out and makes the green stand out because they create contrast with each other. But when they mix, they make brown, which, as I mentioned, is great for fall time. So adding little bits of hints of green to me is really helping just create a little bit more visual interest and not have all the colors be exactly the same. I think I'll do that a few other places just kind of randomly again. So picking maybe an edge and having a little bit of green up against that edge. It's all in the details of a real leaf, has lots of variation in color. Maybe I'll put a little green kind of half of that vein. Sometimes a vein can start or stop a group of colors. Sometimes there's these kind of rips or tears or even dots that look like the leaf has started to degrade. So maybe I'll do even just a few little kind of dots places where things are changing. really working with those happy accidents, things that just kind of happen without trying. We want to embrace those in our random, realistic fall leaf. Okay, I think I'm gonna pause there and I'll see how I like it. I'm gonna go back to this stem. I'm gonna use my tiny brush still because this one's gonna be mostly just be a wet on dry. So I'm just gonna paint the length of my stem. I'm gonna use kind of my brownie red color for this stem. Oh, I just had a blob of water roll down my brush and drop onto my painting. So it just made this very, very wet, which is not what I wanted, but that's fine, it will dry. I'm gonna try to keep that stem really skinny, which is why that drop of water was kind of bothersome because it just made it really much thicker than I wanted. But in relation to the actual painting, it's not bad. And then I'm gonna make the end of my stem a little bit bigger because if you notice, when leaves fall off the tree, they end up with this kind of bigger knob thing at the bottom from where they were attached to the tree. So I'm gonna try to echo that by making the end of my stem bigger. And while my whole stem is wet, I'm gonna go ahead and grab some of my brown and add a little bit of a darker shadow to it if I can. So I'm trying to keep this burnt umber. Nah, my paper is so wet. Okay, I'm gonna dry some of this puddle off of my painting and then I will add the dark shadow. Okay, I just barely blasted it with the heat gun so there wasn't as much of a puddle. And now I'm gonna go grab that darker brown and drop that in, just to create some variation in shadow on my stem, so my stem is as interesting and complicated as the rest of the leaf is, because I used so many different colors and things on the leaf. If my stem was just one color, it might start to feel out of place. So I want to give it some attention as well by adding in some of these dark values, so it's got a little bit more dimension. Okay, I'm pretty happy with how that one turned out. Some things I noticed that I really like are these dark edges. It creates a nice contrast. The little bits of the white pen helped to create that light. With watercolor, it can be hard to leave areas white, and so I really like using a pen to add that back on top. You could also mask it off, but when the line is this thin and skinny, it's easier just to use a thin point pen at the end. So those are the things that I like about it. If I were to do it again, I maybe would add some more veins or maybe keep some of the highlights. I feel like I covered up a lot of the highlights and maybe you could use some more, but I don't know, I'm undecided. It'll be fun to practice more of these. You can leave it like this. It's beautiful just as a painting. I want to show you what it would look like if you did some pen drawing on top of it, because that's one of my favorite things to do to create even more contrast. So I'm gonna use my pen. I'm using a Micron pen. It's just the literally called a pen. There's different sizes, but this one is really easy to use because it's shaped like a regular pen tip, so it's harder to bend or break. And I'm gonna go, and I'm just gonna try to loosely copy the edge of my leaf. I'm not trying to be super exact, so if I miss or like go in or outside of my painting, that's okay. But I'm just trying to find the edges and create more of that contrast and harshness across the whole thing. I'm letting all those random paint pokey bits I did when I was adding my dark edge kind of guide my pen as well. So I want to pay attention to those and I want to keep those because those are what make my leaf very unique, by paying attention to those little jagged edges and emphasizing them with my pen. Okay, I've done the outside line. I'm gonna do that to my stem. And then I'm gonna do that to a few of my veins just by adding kind of a side or an edge or a shadow. So I have the lights, the highlight, and then I'm gonna have this kind of shadow part to it. And I could go even further with some other sort of lines or edges. So maybe I'll go and just create a few more little branching off moments where those veins go even further than I realize without really having to draw them all in. So I'm just making some little suggestive marks. Maybe I'll do some little dots along the edge to just kind of suggest those tears or rips or folds. So just kind of some very random little marks, dots, lines, dashes, maybe some in the middle. It's almost like what we did with the green where we created some little dots. These lines can just create some visual interest and things to look at. And I think that means I'm done. So I'm gonna go ahead and sign my painting and call that one complete. Have so much fun. Check out what's next for something else. Look at my other tutorials. I've got a lovely tree tutorial that works on value a lot, like these lights and darks, something that's always important to practice more of. And I hope I see you next time.